Well, hello to everyone here. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to Unlocking Audience Success with Tom Webster. My name is Elizabeth Hames. I am a Director of Audience Growth here at JAR. If you're not familiar with JAR, JAR is a branded podcast and production and marketing agency based here in Canada. We work exclusively with brands. Um, Tom, for those who do not know Tom, although I'm sure most of you do, Tom is a partner at Sounds Profitable. He's also a Greyhound dad. So if you are a Sounds Profitable partner, one of the perks is photos of his dogs in the Sounds Profitable Slack channel. I recommend it. He's also the author of The Audience is Listening, a little guide to building a big podcast, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Um, I don't know about you, but I was first introduced to Tom through his work with Edison Research many years ago. He worked with Edison for about 18 years studying the audio space and the podcast space more specifically. I came to know Tom through his work there and the incredible work that he's done researching the podcast space, the audience, who the audience is, how they come to know podcasts, and how it's growing over time, which has been absolutely invaluable. So, welcome, Tom. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege, and thanks so much for the kind words.
All right. Well, I'd love to start by hearing a little bit more of your origin story. The book you covered so much great information. I devoured it in a weekend. But I would love to hear a little bit more about how you came to this perspective that you really need to know your audience in order to be able to create a successful show and to grow a successful show. I don't think it is necessarily intuitive. So I'd love to hear
Hmm.
more about how you came to that point of view.
No, it's definitely not intuitive. And I've actually been in media research for 30 years. I was in it for many years, even before I joined Edison. I started with a media research company called Broadcast Architecture back in 1994. We had a lot of radio clients, and so even just as a young employee and then a young executive, I was kind of immersed in the voice of the audience for my entire career. But I was thinking about this because you sent me some excellent questions, and I thank you for that. You're very well prepared, Liz. And I think it actually came from the one single non-media research job I had just before all of that. And I just gotten out of grad school. I had gotten a master's in English from Penn State, and I moved to Princeton, New Jersey, to live with my then girlfriend, later wife, later not wife, who was getting a doctorate at Princeton. And the first job I could get as someone with two English degrees was a job as a tech writer for an environmental consulting company. So I was basically translating the work of scientists into layman's language. And one of the first big reports that I had to write was this environmental assessment that would be read by people at the bank before they would decide to give you a loan. They wanted to make sure there wasn't nuclear waste under the property or whatever. And I thought I was a good writer, and I wrote a very comprehensive, well-written report, and I got it back from my boss at the time. Uh, I'll never forget this guy, Jeffrey Waxman, and it was marked up savagely with the angriest red ink you can imagine. It was just completely demoralizing, and the gist of it was, uh, Tom, you're a very smart guy, but the people reading this aren't, and they don't have a lot of time. Tear it up and try it again. And that was like my first taste of, oh, wait a minute. This isn't being graded by a professor.
Mhm.
This is being scanned by somebody in 10 minutes. And so it actually stemmed from writing. But that said, I've been in media research for a very long time, and so it's always been the backbone of anything I write about.
Hmm. Yeah. That's an interesting story. I've definitely been there myself, having my work written completely over in red ink, which is quite a surprise when you first encounter that.
Yeah,
Um,
it's gutting, especially when you have high self esteem, and you
yeah.
realize I don't wait a minute, I don't know crap. I didn't even consider who was going to be reading this when I wrote it.
Yeah, it's funny. I worked in media for many years. I started as a journalist and in broadcasting and radio before I came into podcasting and podcast marketing, and didn't think too much about my audience. I thought a lot about would someone enjoy this story? Would this be a good story that someone might like? Could this be a story that potentially people within my community could use to help navigate their lives or plan their weekend? But we had so little information in radio, especially the public broadcaster here in Canada. Um, Now we have in podcasting, especially like thanks to you and the work you're doing with Sound is Profitable, we have so much more information about our audience. I'm curious to hear from you how you've taken the information that we can get from our audience, specific to a show, even at the show level, and use that to help understand who your audience is and what they want from you.
Well, I I'm probably going to over-explain this, but I want to back up a little bit because you mentioned a radio background, and I also
Yeah.
had a radio background, at least in radio research. And what I observed are two absolutely incontrovertible facts, kind of in the history of the radio industry, certainly here in America. One was back before was even in media research, back when I was even still in middle school or whatever. Uh, the radio industry didn't really do any research. And there was one company that came out and started doing it. I mean, they were called the Research Group. Good branding there.
Mm-hmm.
And the stations that they worked with started to just completely lap everybody else in the marketplace, right? So it was just the very fact that they were doing something was better than all of the stations doing absolutely nothing. And I think a lot of people in podcasting start to kind of overthink, well, it's not going to be good, it's not going to be as precise, it's going to be something, and it's going to be, incrementally, if not exponentially better than doing absolutely nothing. And then when I did start in media research, I worked for a company that kind of revolutionized radio research, about programming. To date, it was all done with, like Scantron sheets and filling in ovals and things like that. And it tapped into the it tapped into the kind of rational side of your brain. And
Mm-hmm.
we started doing research with these little wireless electronic dials. And I'm sure you've seen them, but this was 1994 and even
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
And so people would listen to this stuff and they would, turn it up if they liked it, turn it down if they didn't. And then again, the stations that did that significantly outperformed the stations in their market that didn't. So even again, just the fact of doing something is better than doing nothing. And there's incredible room for great strides in podcasting just to do something, I think. And all of that is to say, I think that if you have some kind of angle on learning about your audience, then you have some kind of an angle on finding out what really matters to them. And that's not your show, and that's not necessarily the topic of your show, but it's something adjacent to it. And the more you can tap into that, the more you can kind of lock people in, I think, with simpatico, empathy, whatever else it is, to try to keep them in the groove of your show. And the longer you can keep them in that groove, the more loyal they get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you totally that even doing something is going to set you apart. Um, Although we do have a lot of clients here or prospects who come to us and they do know something about their audience. They have usually audience segments or audience personas laid out at least for as clients. So clients or customer personas, and they think maybe they want to target those client personas or customer personas for their podcast. So this is specific kind of to the brand and podcasting space, but they do know something about their
Hmm.
audience, and it can even be quite specific in some instances. But one of the pieces that I think is missing is something that you talk about in your book, which is this quote from Ulysses about knowing who your audience is at home. I'd
Hmm.
love if you could talk a little bit more about that, because that really stood out to me as a difference between knowing a customer profile or an audience profile in terms of demographics and truly understanding who that person is
Yeah.
in the context where they might actually be listening to your show.
Yeah. I'm going to say something that's going to insult a lot of the marketers listening, and I'm, also sort of a marketer. Um, a lot of those avatars and personas that you get are very product or consumer journey focused, right? You'll drum up some kind of an avatar, Oliver outsource, and Oliver outsource is someone who's, at the stage with their company that they're looking to delegate stuff and find somebody to take on these responsibilities of customer relationship management. Well, there's no such human as Oliver outsource. And the best source, and I know one of the questions you asked me, which I'm going to kind of short circuit, is how do you reach difficult people, right? If your audience is the C-suite or something like that, one of the best resources you have in your building is not your marketing team, but it's your sales team, because your sales team is talking to these people. They're talking to them every day. And one of the first pieces of research that I think you should do, even as part of the discovery process, is uh, I mean, a podcast is retail sales at the end of the day. You're trying to get a one-on-one relationship, even if it's kind of one to many. And the salespeople actually know a lot more about that. And the more time you spend, whether you're doing a ride along with a sales team or just listening to them, the more other pieces of the skeleton you can start to put around Oliver outsource that actually, you know what, this is why this is important to that person. This person doesn't really actually want to think about this stuff that much because there's this other thing that they need to spend more time on. And there are a lot of people that have that in common. And what can we do to ease that burden? And so it's less about, the need state of in the consumer journey in that sense. And it's more about trying to put more flesh on the bones, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great point. Talking to the sales team, I hadn't thought of that, but that makes a ton of sense. Those are the people who are facing every day with the potential people who are going to be listening to your podcast. I love that. And you did kind of allude to a question that I was going to ask you about. Many clients, especially in the B2B space, they're interested in reaching the C-suite. They're interested in reaching directors, those business decision makers. That does kind of raise a couple of flags for me, though. One is people who are listening to podcasts are probably not listening to podcasts to think about what kind of software to buy for their enterprise. And the other is people in the C-suite are just so busy. How do you go about doing audience research and asking them questions? Are they actually going to respond to surveys?
Hmm.
What have you seen in your work in this space?
Yeah, and it's easy to get hung up on the numbers, right? Like, how am I going to get people to respond to this survey? But if you're able to get 25 Fortune 500 CMOs to respond to a survey, that's a pretty good number, right? Because that's a pretty large percentage of the actual universe you're talking to. You're not going to get thousands and thousands of people, so you can kind of get that out of your head. But again, kind of going back to talking to the sales team, one of the best things you can do is to take a few out to lunch, buy them lunch, and just listen to their jobs. And the C-suite may be the decision makers in the process, but they are usually the final stop on a chain that maybe they instigated, and then it comes back to them. And the C-suite themselves, they mostly have one job, and that is to manage people and not get fired, right? And it's not about choosing the right software as a service or SaaS or whatever. It's mostly about managing people. And um, when you start to look at the human dilemma of that, then you start to rethink, well, what does that person want to listen to? One of the best examples of this, because again, podcasting just has so much to learn, and so many other products and services have really mastered this. When Toyota launched the Lexus brand in the United States, they wanted to reach wealthy, uh, you know, uh, lords and lordesses of industry, and they did a little demographic research on them, and they discovered that one of the things that a lot of them had in common was that they lived in exurban areas. They lived very far from where they had to commute to, and so they really had these significant commutes, and these were oases of quiet for them. And so when Lexus first launched, they launched with one word. They launched with quiet. And they didn't just launch with a word, they over-engineered the product to be that way because they realized that's how they were not going to outperform its BMW and Mercedes. But what they could do was over-optimize on something that was actually important that was not necessarily related to a feature on a car. And that was quiet, and that was one of the key insights in the great history of market research in this company. I think was how that brand launched. And I think the more we talk about understanding the needs of an audience, and again, those needs aren't product focused and they're not your company focused, but you can figure them out, and it usually that takes a more human conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I know I've seen some really interesting ways that clients have gone about doing this kind of research. A few years ago, I was working with a client, Red Hat, which is an open source software company. They surveyed people at a conference, sat down with their target audience, which was tech practitioners who may one day use their product. And they just sat them down and asked them questions about, what kinds of problems are you having at work? Who are you at work? Just various questions about themselves, their personal lives, their work lives. And these were real one-to-one conversations. The person who was leading this project, Brent Simino, is a trained ethnographer, I think, and so was is just naturally very curious about people, and they used that the responses to develop a show called Command Line Heroes, which put the tech practitioner as the hero of the story, this at the center of the story, and help them feel seen and help them feel like their jobs were recognized for how important they actually are. And that show went on for 9 seasons, was very successful, a very creatively brave show. I just thought that was such a lovely, real human approach to understanding your audience. We have clients now who have Slack channels where they communicate directly one to one with the communities that they're trying to talk to for a show. And so we encourage them to, reach out to people through that Slack channel. I'd love to hear any examples that you can share of some interesting ways that people have surveyed their audience or come to try and understand them through this more qualitative research.
So I'm a huge fan of ethnographic research, and I've done a fair amount in my career of it. And ethnographic research is it's not as much about asking questions because that can be directed, and you have a bias on that. But it's just about watching people in their environment actually doing the things, right? I'll give you a media example and a non-media example. The non-media example is a great Procter and Gamble example where they were trying to improve a laundry detergent or try to increase sales of it, and they just watched people do laundry in their own homes. And what they discovered was that everybody's washing machine was a gross soupy mess on the top of like detergent rings and stuff like that. And so what they focused on was a spill proof cap, right? And that's now the standard, but at the time it was a huge innovation, and it was just based on watching people. But one of the it was sort of a mix of ethnography and survey work that I'm most proud of being involved with was a study that I did in conjunction with my colleagues at Edison, uh, called the Commuter Code, and it was taking a look at how people did or did not behave differently in terms of media in their car, depending on what their source of entertainment was. And so some of that was survey, but another part of it was we actually sent people GoPro cameras and mounts and instructions, and we obviously paid them to do this, and asked them to focus that camera on whatever their entertainment source was for the duration of their commute. And then we took all of that video and we coded it second by second. What did they do? When did they do it? Why did they do it? And for some people, it was a 5-button AM/FM radio. For some people, it was their smartphone patched into their dashboard. However, and for some people, it was a much more integrated, CarPlay, Android Audio, that kind of thing. And what we discovered, which was sort of a counterintuitive insight, was that the more technology that people had in their car, the more access to multiple digital sources of entertainment they had in their car, the less they switched. And I think people, have this image that people have short attention spans, and if you give people a million choices instead of five choices, that they'll be all over the place. But that wasn't true. What was true was that the more access to the content that people had, the more they could find exactly what they wanted to listen to, and they were more satisfied for longer periods of time. And so, that was a really key ethnographically driven insight. And as one of the reasons why I continue to be, obviously I'm very bullish on podcasting. I still think there are some discontinuous jumps that it can make, and one of them is removing the friction in the car. And I think that the more we can improve the hardware and software of being able to consume podcasts in the car, the more continuous time people are going to spend with.
Mm, yeah, interesting. I mean, we're talking about some like very creative ways of doing qualitative research. I know a lot of people probably on this call will maybe not have the resources to be able to do that kind of research, either like timing wise or budget wise. I'm curious how you might recommend that people do this kind of research. Maybe you can give us a couple of examples, like first before they actually have a show and an audience, and then second, I know in your book you have a few recommendations for how people might get these kinds of questions and
Mm-hmm.
answered after they have an audience. And
Yep.
also, I will just say, anyone who has a question, please do submit in the Q&A. It is open for you to ask Tom your questions at the end of our session today.
Yeah. So I think the first step, and this is true whether you haven't started or you have started, that I continue to think is the absolute best thing you can do, is to think about where the humans that you're trying to reach are gathered in real life. And I don't mean
Mm-hmm.
at their companies. Where else do they gather? I did a ton of out of home research when I was at Edison. I mean, I worked on the exit polls for 18 years. That's the biggest out of home research study in America. But what you get if you can find a way to survey people at an event or at a place where they're gathered, and even if you just walk around with a clipboard, buy people a drink or whatever, you can actually get a lot more response, get a lot more data than if you just fire off an email survey, which typically have a very low response rate. So on the one hand, the curmudgeon in me says that if you're not willing to spend any money or resources in this, then fine, don't do it. Um, and you will get the results that you've earned.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to find people in real life, gathering in their real life watering holes wherever you can, and give them some kind of incentive. We talked about the C-suite earlier. One of the things that works really well are donations, and if you can make some kind of donation in kind to something local or that they care about in exchange for some of their time, right? And the pharmaceutical companies used to do this all the time. The laws have gotten a little stricter on that, but they would they would buy doctors dinner in exchange for 20 minutes of continuing education or whatever. So, you may have to make some kind of investment here, but it's not necessarily handing people an envelope full of cash. It could be access to content that they wouldn't normally have. It could be access to a gated community. It could be, again, it could be a donation in kind to something. It could be an act of service. There's all kinds of things that you can do that might be relevant to your audience. So, and ultimately, a lot of the people who tell me that they can't do this have not even tried the most minimal things, which is to just have a conversation with six listeners. And, and you can beg for that however you want in your show itself and give people access to that, but at least try that.
Mm-hmm. What happens if you can't get anyone to respond?
Well, I have a kind answer and I have an unkind answer. Um,
Let's hear both.
yeah. So the unkind answer is that nobody deserves an audience, and you don't have a right to an audience, and you don't have a right to get these. And so, If no one at all is responding to you and you have a show, it might be an indictment of your show, and you need to find something else. Um, so that's the unkind answer, I think. The kind answer is that it just takes time, and the more you can do to stay engaged with podcasting, the more you can do to try to stay nimble and facile and responsive and listening in areas where maybe you're not directly talking to people, but where those people are gathered. You can always listen to conversations that are happening and learn something. So, I'll give you a great example of this actually, and this again is a non-media example, but um, uh, Kellogg's Special K actually started to completely rebrand and remarket themselves as a diet food. There was even a diet plan around Special K.
Yeah.
And that's because they did a lot of listening to social conversations, and they discovered the two words coming together a lot, which was cereal for dinner. And what they just learned from listening to those conversations was, look, people have cereal for dinner for one of three reasons, right? They can't afford, they have food insecurity, they're drunk, or they're trying to lose weight. And so, Special K did the sort of most the kindest interpretation of that, and rebranded their cereal a bit more as having like a diet plan, and there were Special K diet bars and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just from listening, and you can listen as long as you understand that social media listening is fraught with a whole bunch of other biases, but it does help you learn about people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm this is a question that's just kind of come up for me. I'm curious how much time you would dedicate to this, like in the grand scheme of things. Would you set aside some time at the beginning of developing a show for this and then revisit it later on? Are we looking at surveying people over weeks or over months?
Honestly, whenever you start, you have no audience, and so it's not like you can ask your audience. The thing that I would recommend doing the most is, even before you have an audience, is to have a point of view. It's to have a perspective that is consistent from show to show. It's from one of my wife Tamsin and I's favorite musicals, Sunday in the Park with George, the Sondheim musical, right? Anything you do, let it come from you, and then it will be new.
Mm-hmm.
What is your unique perspective on something? And the next step in that, I think, is to try making 6 shows and don't release them. Put them under a bed, and then come back to them and listen to them again, the oldest one first, with fresh ears, and ask yourself, am I getting better? Is this really interesting? Would I do this different? And that's a place to start. If you would do it different, great. You can now do it different because you didn't release those shows. And so I'm a big fan of something Stephen King talks about in his memoir about writing, is putting the drafts under the bed. And I'm a big fan of putting drafts under the bed before you release anything. Once you release it, you never get another chance to make a first impression. And
Mm-hmm.
but the corollary of that is you're always earning an audience. So the audience could be new every week. You always have a chance to earn an audience. But why not take the time at the very start of the process? Don't release it. Do a bunch of them and put them under the bed. And I can hear in my head people complaining that this is not authentic and you want it rough and raw. No, they don't. People want high quality entertainment, and something can be authentic and can touch emotions and still be highly produced and highly edited. In fact, the best things are.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not a big fan of the authenticity argument for not doing that kind of thing. But that's kind of where I would start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 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 definitely. We're definitely big proponents here of heavy editing at JAR. We do a lot of work in the production process, but also we do a lot of work up front in the pre-production process to try and develop a show to be thinking about our audience and keeping our audience in mind, and not just who the audience persona is, but also who they are at home, like you say, which is something I think I'll be using from now on. I love that. I love that phrase. But that really gets to the heart of something that we do quite a lot is trying to understand our audience, not just in terms of what they do for work or what demographic profiles they might fit into, but what is motivating them in life, what is going to cause them to want to first seek out this show and then hit play on the show. Um, I'd love to hear more from you about the kinds of questions you might ask people to help help a podcaster, help a creator better understand their audience in terms of who they are at home, as opposed to a segment or a demographic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, asking people, what do you think of my podcast is not going to get you very satisfying results.
Mm,
Um, because, in general, people lack the articulation of positive language that they have with negative language. Um, people will be very specific about something that they don't like, but if you generally ask people, what did you really like about my podcast? You're likely to get some, thought terminating cliches. Oh, it's funny. Oh, it's interesting. And that's not enough to get better. So, ideally, I think you're asking more questions about the human than you are your podcast. So I'll start with one that I really love, and that is ask people what other podcasts they listen to. Now, I'll tell you what a marketer does with that information, and then I'll tell you what I do with that information. A marketer looks at that and goes, all right, these are some other shows that we should be doing feed drops on, that we should be doing cross promotion, that we should be buying ads on. And that's tactical, that's advertising and promotions, but that's not marketing with a capital M. If I'm working on a sports show and it is the only sports show that people name, I want to know why. I want to know why it stands out in an island of other podcasts. If it's one of 6 sports shows that they answer, I want to know what makes it different. I want to know when, do you listen to these shows at different contexts of your life? Is there one you always listen to when you take a walk? Is there one you always listen to in the car? Well, tell me about that. So, I'm looking for context questions. And, that does a couple of things. First of all, it gives you a little bit more information about what really stands out about your show, if anything. And then, it also, I think, provides a ladder to asking other questions about who they are at home, where you can actually start to talk about your podcast and other podcasts because you've primed them a little bit to start thinking about how the show is used and not just what do they think of the show. And also I'm a trained qualitative researcher, and there's lots of techniques that qualitative researchers use, but I'll share one with you, and that
mhm,
is, especially when you're asking people questions about something that they don't often think about. And I had a lot of experience doing this in the radio industry. People don't often spend a lot of time thinking about their favorite radio stations. It's kind of low on their list.
mhm,
Um, but if you get people who you can tell have a relationship with the station, but they're not really able to articulate it, then I like to give them wacky questions like, if this station or product were a car, what kind of a car would it be?
mhm,
If it were an animal, what kind of animal would it be? And if someone says it's a lumbering hippo, well, okay, I want to dig in on that, right? You're going to get different. You're going to access a different level of articulation. So, I like to ask as many questions as I can that give people an easy way to respond instead of making them do all the work of giving me show notes, because they're not going to
mhm.
be able to give you show notes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I do want to prompt people again. If you do have any questions for Tom, please put them in the Q&A. There's so much great advice in this book about what kinds of questions to ask, and also the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. A lot of that, like an interesting divide there, how you talk about which kinds of questions to ask in different contexts. One of the things that you say in the book is that it's unlikely that anyone reading the book is probably going to get any kind of scientific reading of or research results for qualitative research. So can you first explain like the difference between the two, and then what that qualitative research might look like, even if it's not scientific?
Yeah. So, at first I'll go back to something that we talked about at the very beginning. Do something. It's better than nothing, because it at least gives you a focal point, and
Hmm.
see if you can grow with that, and then we'll move on from there. But quantitative research is really good for answering. It's good for counting things, right? It's good for counting how many people share this same viewpoint. What are some quantitative uh, who and what things that those people have in common. So it's really good at counting at who questions and what questions. It's not very good at how and why. And for how and why, you can't give people multiple choice answers because you've already put your thumb on the scales by determining what those multiple choice answers will be. So usually when I'm doing an engagement with a client, I'll start with qualitative. And here I'm just trying to figure out why these people do the things that they do. And, you know, and maybe, and there's no single why, right? There's no, the whole like thing that Simon Sinek talked about was start with why. People have taken that wrong way too far. It was about leadership. There's no single why that people do things, but there aren't a million of them either. And so
Hmm.
you at least start with some theories. You're trying to not come up with the exact answer, but some hypotheses.
Hmm.
And in quantitative research, which is more surveys and things like that, that's when you can start to count how many people share those things and test them out, right? But qualitative research to me is, I already mentioned ethnographic research, but it's conversations, and when whether that's it's interviews, it's meeting people at events and just getting them to talk a little bit, and seeing when you can catch that glint in their eye and the kind of nonverbal communication and things like that. So, but if you want to know why, it's a two-stage process, and it has to start with conversations, and it has to start with whether they're formal interviews or not. You have to get the language from people first, and then if you want to, you can survey using that language to see how many people share those same opinions, and that gives you some kind of a direction. And that's the nuts and bolts of the whole cycle, and it is a cycle because it never ends.
Yeah, yeah, the cycle of insight, as you refer to it in your book. Yeah. And so, what do you do then with once you have that qualitative research? What do you do with that? How have you seen that shape a show or maybe take a show in a different direction?
Yep. Some of it can be attitude, and yeah, you can get hung up on sample size, right? I mean, and qualitative research is not really about sample size. If someone says, well, how can I trust what 12 people had to say? Well, if 12 people, if 10 of 12 people said your zipper was open, your zipper's probably open, right? You probably don't need 1,000 people for that. And so you can at least look for the is my zipper open moments
Hmm.
when you're doing that kind of thing. But, I'll here's an example from my career. It's one of the things I'm probably one of the things I'm most proud of from my radio career. I did a lot of work in the UK, especially back in the 90s. And, a lot of that work was centered on London, but then I was also doing work in Birmingham and Manchester. And uh, the company that I was consulting at the time won a license to start a brand new station in Newcastle. And, Newcastle, pretty far from London. It's pretty much at the Scottish border. And, we did a bunch of music testing, and the music came back very different from what it might have come back in London. And we just started talking to people, like literally talking to people on the streets. And what we found there that was incredibly different from London was uh, was there was a lot more optimism. People were much sunnier. They just want to, and that's not a dig on people from London. I lived in London for a while. It's a different vibe, right? And so the people, they wanted to go out, they wanted to have a good time, and they were not cynical. And so the station was at the time being worked on and consulted by a whole bunch of cynical people like me. And so that changed our attitude about the whole thing. It made us do all of our work with a smile on our face, and it made us look for people who shared that because it would communicate that better. and it was one of the most successful launches in certainly in that company's history, but in the UK, a station called Galaxy Northeast, and it was a kind of a dance station. It was just a feel good station,
Mm.
and that came from understanding the vibe of the people in that city much more than the what of the music that they liked. So that's one of the biggest examples from my media career I can think of.
Yeah, yeah, that really speaks to the difference I think that we an issue we can encounter now, or there's a difference between online communication and offline communication, and who people are online versus who people are offline. So yeah, I love that insight, actually going into the real world and talking to real people. We do have a few questions popping up, so I'd like
Mhm.
to turn to them. um, Tobin says, "This is great stuff, thanks. Do those audience surveys you see linked in the episode description work? And what are the best apps or services to poll your audience?" Do you have any thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
Well, I mean, a lot of hosting companies are offering those tools now. And again, if they're free, it's better than nothing. There are paid tools that you can use. Uh, you know, Typeform to SurveyMonkey to on the very high end things like Qualtrics. But it could be a Google form. It could be some emails. Maybe just try giving people a link to a Google form and see what happens. And then and again, uh, when you talk about like sample size and response rate and things like that, if you get 12 replies and they're all over the map, it didn't work. But if you get 12 responses and they're 10 of them are pretty much in agreement, you know, maybe there's something there. And you don't have to worry so much about what's the margin of error on that. The margin of error on that is yes.
Mm,
But again, if it's a your zipper's open moment, then those kinds of things can really help. But to start with, I think just even a Google form is better than nothing.
mhm, mm. Another question. There's been a move away from downloads as the metric of success for podcasts, but rather listen through rate, verified listeners, and total time listened. Do you think these are the right measures? And if you could create a measure, what would it be? I'd love that question.
That's a really good question. Yeah, um, I'm a big fan of completion rate. I want to know. So I'll just get slightly wonky here, right? I think with a lot of podcasts that are having trouble growing, all they have is a primary audience. They have a small ride or die audience that listen to them whenever they publish a new episode because it's a very niche topic, or they're connected to them somehow, and that's all they have, and that's not healthy. The healthiest kind of development of an audience is that you have a primary, you have a secondary, and you have a tertiary audience. And the primary audience is that ride or die every episode. The secondary audience will look at the topic, and you're in their list, you're in their consideration set, but maybe you're not interested in that interview, but you'll listen to the next one, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then the tertiary audience um, is an audience that you can develop into a secondary audience, but they caught a show, they caught a clip. Maybe they caught something you did in video. That's a key to building a tertiary audience. I'm convinced.
Mm.
And you don't necessarily listen to them as much as you would your primary audience, but it's dangerous to only listen to your primary audience. But the one thing I will tell you about completion rate, and it's a really good question to ask in your surveys, just how much of the show, how much of all of the episodes do you listen to, how much of the show itself do you listen to, and of course you get some of that data in Apple, and Spotify gives you some of that data, right? Um,
Mm.
you want to see if people are finishing your show, and B, those are good people to talk to, and C, the people who aren't finishing your show are also good people to talk to. It's another bucket
Mm.
of listener, right? So
Mhm.
uh, so listen through rate, completion rate, whatever you want to call it. That's one I really want to know. Am I just giving people a snippet of information they're interested in, or are they engaged by the show? Are they engaged
Mhm.
by the personalities? So, um, if I could create a measure, what would it be? I will tell you, there's no stronger piece of measurement that I've ever done in my career than those stupid little wireless dials, and getting people in whether it's a small group setting or a larger group setting, listening to content and using those dials to turn it up or turn it down, depending on how engaging or interesting it is to them. And that is that's a measure of engagement, and that's a measure of the peaks and valleys of a show. And I like to see what are the peaks and valleys of a show. Completion rate is flat and tails off, but any show has wow. Okay, I'm waiting for the next thing. Wow, or just if you're not getting this, but you're getting this, then that's a show that has some risk to it. That's a show that has
Mhm.
some trouble to it. So and that's not the easiest thing for the individual podcaster to get, but one thing you can do uh, is sort of talk about your show segment by segment and
Mhm.
see if people have favorite segments or not as favorite segments and things like that. And if you don't have that, if it's just I'm turning on the mic and talking for an hour, well, there's your problem right there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because you're not
Yeah.
you're not systematically building in peaks and valleys, because no one's pegged at 100 the whole time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we've used here retention charts in Apple Podcasts. Those can provide some insight. I have seen even sometimes where advertisements come in, especially if
Mm-hmm.
it's a branded show and the advertisement is for the the products of that brand. Uh, that's reflected in the retention charts. So you can see a drop off there, which is why we always encourage a light brand touch for our clients. The other thing that we've experimented with is having timestamps and show notes so
Mm-hmm.
that people can go to specific sections of the podcast. They can navigate there. So if we do see little peaks, then we know, oh, that particular topic was maybe a little more interesting to people, interesting enough that they wanted to fast forward to that spot. So
Mm-hmm.
Apple Podcasts can provide a little bit of insight. And I also know YouTube has similar metrics
Right.
of that dial.
Yeah.
But maybe we should bring back the dial. Put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah. And here's something I've been thinking about lately. And I've been writing a lot about video, and it pains me to do it because I'm very much podcasting is an audio first medium. Is the overwhelming majority of consumption. Consumption is audio, but that doesn't mean it's on an audio platform. And you know, I'm just seeing so much in the research that I do and that I see from other companies that it's a really essential tool for discovery for people.
Mm-hmm.
And also, people will choose video or audio for the same shows depending on the context and situation and environment that they're in. So, having the choice
Mm-hmm.
is important as well. But the one interesting thing that you can do, you may not be able to have those wireless dials, but it, if you did a show live somehow, one great thing about YouTube, just as a tool for this, is that you can do a show live and you can have a chat.
Mm-hmm.
And that chat is a place where you or somebody else uh, could start a dialogue with people or right, and see how they respond to those kinds of things. So it can use it as a uh, it may not be the final home or your preferred home for your podcast, but it's a way to get engagement in the moment, that might be useful to you.
Mm-hmm. I This question about video raises a really interesting question for me. I mean, we've been talking today about the importance of knowing your audience so you can build a show for them. And that sort of traces the line to growth, right? If people are really loving your show, they're going to want to recommend it, they're going to want to talk about it. And we know through your research that that's like the number one way people discover new
Right.
podcasts. But we're kind of entering a new world now, right? We've got YouTube with its discoverability engine, and now Spotify just announced it's kind of got this
Yep.
YouTube rivalry going on. Do you see that changing? Are we operating on a premise that is going to look old in a few years, or is, knowing your audience going to continue to be the primary driver of success?
Yeah. I mean, I would say two things about that. Number one, uh, y- you can have an audio only podcast and I would be the first one to you know cheer you on. I don't do a video podcast. I don't plan to, but it's also an advantage. And the key to finding peace with that is understanding that for the most part, the audio audience and the video audience are the same humans. They are making different choices depending on their environment. And if you think things about the video audience that are uncomplimentary to them, what I would tell you is that we have done research that shows that when people choose to consume a podcast on video over audio, and it's a podcast that they do both with, it's often because they want to pay more attention to it. They are able to focus on it. Their attention is not doing other things like driving or housework, and actually watching the humans, the heads of the humans talk into the mics helps them pay more attention to it. And so when you think about that, you think a little bit differently about the video audience. And I know that's largely YouTube right now, but it doesn't have to be and shouldn't be. But the other thing I would say to that is, if we do that, then I think it's incumbent upon us to communicate better to our listeners and viewers what makes a podcast different from a Mr. Beast video. What makes a podcast different and special, so that you know what, this is a podcast. And this is what I do with podcasts in my life that I don't do with TikTok in my life. And these are the specific reasons. Podcasting used to be a technical definition. It's not anymore. It just isn't. That's something you have to get past. So I'm not telling you that you have to be on video. I'm telling you that it's an advantage.
Mm-hmm. I have another question from Ramatilla. Hi, Ramatilla. We know each other from Pacific Content Days. He says, hey, Tom, what are your thoughts on using social media as a tool to understand and grow your audience? Here's my struggle. At the outset, I find platforms like Instagram and TikTok to be fickle and unpredictable, contrary to what we hope and expect from a listener of our show. Listen/mediate on an episode for approximately 25 minutes. But social platforms are also where you can have the quickest and most cost-effective conversations. So how can you use social media to grow an audience for a show?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to choose the right platform. And the most underutilized, underdeveloped social media platform for podcasting is also the largest in certainly the largest in America, and I think the largest in Canada, and that remains Facebook. And does Facebook have native embedded podcast? No, it's not. That's not why people go to Facebook, but they are going there to have conversations with people, and they are going there to view and share clips of things. And the attitude I have about social media is I don't think social media is a great place to just stick your podcast, right? People aren't going to TikTok to hear a 30-minute show. Mm-hmm. That's not their mode of thinking when they go to TikTok. And so that's not what they're there for. But it's a great place for a podcaster. It is a great place, I think, for you to do something that is self-contained, a thing unto itself, not a tease that a sentence they have to finish by going to your podcast, but something that just works in that space and no more. And that's how you start to build an audience for the podcaster. And then you can, and then there's the deeper engagement, which might be the full length show. So, but the first stage of that, I think, is understanding where your audience is. And if TikTok isn't working for you, are you sure that that's where the most likely audience for your show is gathered? It might be popular, but are you a TikToker? I don't know. I'm not a TikToker. Mm-hmm. So that's a big part of it.
Mm-hmm. We just have a couple minutes left. One last question, and then I'd love to hear a final thought from you if you have one. Ali says, how can ethnographic research be applied to podcast guests rather than listeners? What's the balance between respecting the time commitment that's being asked of guests and getting the right info to ask targeted questions for higher quality answers?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to put this, and I know some diabolically sinister branded podcasts that do this, is to have prospects for your company on as guests. And that's where you can, they will be, potentially flattered potentially talking about things that they would not talk about in a product conversation. And maybe makes them a little bit warmer to your company. And that's a diabolically branded podcast strategy. So I mean that is something that you can do because if only for 30 or 60 minutes a podcast guest is also one of your listeners. And it's always worth doing a post-mortem with them. What did you like about the interview? What compared to other things that you've done, how did this show stand out, right? And if people won't share that episode, there might be some, be honest. Why don't you tell me that? And tell me why not? What could I have done better? I do think, in market research, there's people have to know that they're being surveyed. There's a, do no harm kind of Hippocratic oath about it, but there's nothing wrong with having a conversation with your guests.
Mhm. All right, we have about 2 minutes left. Tom, any final thoughts? Anything you wanted to say before we go?
Yep. The only thing I would say to wrap this up, and thank you for the time and for talking about the book with me. I really appreciate that. I wrote the book because I got so many questions from people. How do I grow my audience? How do I grow my audience? And the question I want them to ask is, why did my audience stop growing? Because that is the precursor to that question. Why did my audience stop growing, or why am I losing audience? And there's kind of one answer to that, and it's because people stop recommending your show. And if you're not doing any advertising and you never did before, and you just sort of stop growing, uh, that's one of the most important questions you can ask: is why aren't people recommending the show?
Mm-hmm. And if people want to connect with you or find your book, where's the best place to do that?
Connect with me at soundsprofitable.com. Our research and articles are available for free for anybody interested in the industry. The book itself you can find at audienceislisteningbook.com. Audienceislisteningbook.com is where you can find places to buy the print or electronic version of it and the audiobook version.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Tom. It was such a pleasure. All right. And thank you to everyone who joined today. And yeah, take care.